Well, welcome everyone. It's wonderful to see both, I won't call them old faces, friends of long standing, as I prefer old friends, who are back. Nice to see you, and new friends, welcome. It's my great pleasure to be able to introduce the president of Tufts University, Tony Monaco. As many of you know, he's the 13th president of Tufts University and came in 2011, I believe. Around you are surrounded by previous portraits of previous presidents here, but you'll get to see him in living color before you. Tony, we greatly appreciate the number of times you have opened GDAE events, and we welcome you to open this one. Thank you.
Well, there's not much space left on the walls here, so I'm not sure where they're going to put my portrait. I think perhaps over the recycling bins, which would be entirely appropriate. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here for this year's ceremony and lecture for the Leontief Prize. I think this is the 17th year that GDAE at Tufts University has presented this prize for the Advancing the Frontiers of Economic Thought. The prize has a distinguished history from its first recipient, Nobel laureate Amartya Sen and John Kenneth Galbraith, to Mariana, Mazzucato, and Branko Milanovic, who we will honor today. Before I talk about today's ceremony, I'd like to say a few words about what this award means to Tufts. It aims to recognize, and I quote, outstanding contributions to economic theory that address contemporary realities and support just and sustainable societies. The Leontief Prize therefore stands for one of our hallmark values as an institution, leveraging our intellectual and academic strengths to confront the greatest challenges facing the world. Indeed, it is this spirit of impact-oriented scholarship and teaching that frames Tufts' mission. We believe that this commitment to bridge the gap between theory and practice benefits future generations and contributes to the significance of our work as a university. For over 20 years, GDAE has been at the forefront of essential interdisciplinary scholarship and teaching at Tufts. Its programs have married international development with environmental sustainability, and they have pioneered research and policy recommendations to meet the challenges of the 21st century. GDAE has been integral to Tufts' development as an institution that is intimately involved with greeting such challenges head-on. And it truly represents the interdisciplinary spirit of Tufts. GDAE works across schools and departments. It involves both graduate and undergraduate students, from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy and the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy, to our Urban and Environmental Policy and Planning program, and others in arts and sciences. GDAE and its projects marshal all the strengths of Tufts to do work that reflects our highest institutional values. Today, we recognize two outstanding scholars of developmental economics who represent the best of the tradition that GDAE champions and embodies. The 2018 Leontief Prize for Advancing the Frontiers of Economic Thought is presented today in the spirit of the theme, Globalization, Innovation, and Inequality. We live in challenging times, economically and globally. But it is exactly during times like these that the economic interests of development must be informed by concerns environmental sustainability and equity. It is exactly this sensibility that we celebrate today in the lives and careers of our Leontief Prize recipients by recognizing Dr. Mazzucato, who is a Tufts alum and a former rower at Tufts, and Dr. Milanovic. Congratulations to you both. I'm very much look forward to hearing the lectures. I'd also like to thank everyone who's made this event and the Leontief Prize possible, including the Fletcher School International Development Group and the Tufts Institute of the Environment, and to extend a warm welcome to everyone for coming out to be part of this exciting event. It's always wonderful to celebrate the great work being done at Tufts and the scholars and practitioners around the world who inspire it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tony. That was really nice. I'm Neva Goodwin, the co-director of the Tufts University's Global Development and Environment Institute, which we know as GDAE, or if we're thinking Australian, sometimes GDAE. The Institute has been in existence for 25 years, and during this time it has brought expertise in economics, policy, and science to the publication of more than 30 books and numerous articles, policy documents, and discussion papers. The materials we produce are used in academic settings to enhance the teaching of economics and related subjects, and in policy circles where GDAE researchers are recognized leaders in their fields. Our textbooks, educational modules, and original research cover many different areas, including globalization, agriculture, climate change, micro and macroeconomics, and environmental and natural resource economics. During the past quarter century, GDAE has emphasized the need for a broader understanding of economics and the economy to ensure, in particular, the inclusion of social and environmental issues. We annually, more or less, award the Leontief Prize to two economists who've made outstanding contributions to economic theory to address contemporary realities and support just and sustainable societies. The first of the two economists whom we will recognize today is Mariano Mazzucato, an economist who combines extraordinarily keen logic and rigor with a great instinct for asking the critical questions that no one else has thought of, or where they think that the answers are already known or obvious. One of her best-known and much-cited books is The Entrepreneurial State, Debunking Public versus Private Sector Myths, which was on the Financial Times 213 Books of the Year list. In this, and in a wide variety of papers as well as other books, she describes the critical role of government in innovation, where taxpayers, it turns out, have been the real venture capitalists. As private finance has in recent trends retreated from providing capital to the real economy, the role of government has become ever more important. But, as she points out, this role can only be played by governments that are effectively oriented to a mission of well-defined public service, with dynamic and creative bureaucracies. In the current climate of opinion, where people sneer at the idea that government or its internal bureaucracies can be effective, let alone dynamic, Mariana provides critically important support for a strengthened government role through her well-researched, convincingly argued writings and her policy work, which combines creativity and imagination with a strong practical sense for how to get things done. This is the mission of her new Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at University College London, where policy makers from around the world come for advice on how to deliver smart, inclusive, and sustainable growth. Dr. Mazzucato is currently a member of the Scottish Government's Council of Economic Advisors, the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network Leadership Council, and Sitra's advisory panel in Finland. There are more, but I'll stop there for that, but mention that she's won a number of distinguished awards, and in 2013 was named one of the 3 most important thinkers about innovation in the New Republic. Her current research projects include 2 that are funded by the EC Horizon 2020 program, Innovation-Fueled Sustainable Inclusive Growth, and Distributed Global Financial Systems for Society. She's working on projects on rethinking medical innovation, funded by the Open Society Foundations, and a project on mission-oriented innovation policies with the Inter-American Development Bank. She's co-editor of a new book, Rethinking Capitalism, Economics and Policy for Sustainable Inclusive Growth, and her latest book, The Value of Everything, has just come out. In the UK. Well, I'm very lucky to have an early copy. We're honored today to recognize Mariano Mazzucato as a recipient of the 2018 Leontief Award. Thank you so much.
So thank you so much, Tony and Vina, for welcoming us, Branko and I. I think we both have very difficult names to pronounce, so that's good, because I think if you're introducing two speakers and one is really easy and one's harder, one will feel a bit less happy. This way we're both equally challenged. I must say that stepping onto this campus after, I'm embarrassed to say, basically almost 30 years, the first thing I felt was pain. And the reason is that, well, as Tony said, I used to row, but we didn't have a boathouse at the time. So we had to use Harvard's boathouse, Harvard Men's, strangely, not Harvard Women's. And the coach, don't ask me how I remember this guy's name, Chris Korzanowski. You know how you sometimes remember random things and you forget the big things. He later became an Olympic coach, perhaps that's why I remember him. And he wanted us in and out of his boathouse by 8 in the morning. Now, the only reason I can assume is that we must have been such beautiful young women that he did not want his men to get distracted, but he said no overlap, not 1 minute, you had to be in and out. So we would wake up, that's why I feel pain, at 4:45 every morning and run to the boathouse. I want to say 6 miles. Is that possible? Is it possible? Okay. Row, and then a gentle van would bring us back. And I must say that I learned what colts were, because I remember having breakfast, in the canteen, in the dining room, and just thinking, what has anyone else done to deserve their breakfast? So you definitely feel superior. Anyway, it was painful. I would never, ever do that. And if my kids today said they were going to do that, I'd say, no, I'm paying for university to study. Do not wake up at 4:45 in the morning. So luckily, my father, who's here in the room, and my mother did not dissuade me from doing that. Anyway, so oh, good, there's a clicker. So I have 25 minutes, and I have a timer here that will go off when I go over that. And what I'd like to talk about is the need to think about the direction of growth as being just as important, if not more important, than the rate of growth, which we usually obsess about. And first of all, this is a great time to be doing that because there are, especially but not only after the financial crisis, lots of conversations about this, at least in theory, around the world. So if you go to the European Commission or also the OECD and the UN, there's lots of talk about growth that's of a particular type. So innovation-led, sustainable, more green, inclusive growth, especially after the works of people like Branko and Piketty, who've really put inequality up on the agenda. And of course, there's the SDGs, which are fantastic. Some people criticize them as feeling a bit too listy, but hey, over 100 countries have signed up to them. That's about directing investments in a particular way. And in many countries, including the UK where I live, there is a comeback of industrial strategy, which is also about directed growth, so trying to fuel growth, whether it's in particular sectors, which I find sometimes problematic, or problems for different types of sectors to help solve, which I'll talk about more at the end. So this is kind of the good news, that this idea of directionality, this is the time to be talking about it because there's lots of conversations. The bad news is that we have a policy toolkit in economics, and we are quite influential as a breed in terms of, Keynes had a great quote. He said, even those practitioners who think they're just kind of getting their hands dirty and doing things, they're not worried about theory, are actually slaves of defunct economic theory. So yes, we have a problematic defunct theory which kind of trains civil servants, practitioners on the ground, whether it's at city level governments, local, regional, national, to think in particular ways. The first thing they have to do is identify the market failure that they're going to fix, right? So there's this whole kind of market fixing view. And by the way, it's a very important one because there are many different types of market failures. They're supposed to set the rules of the game. They're supposed to, again, fix whether it's system or market failures, but especially these words, and just maybe look at my expression, even though I'm a bit of more of an actress sometimes than an economist when I do my facial expressions in this case. But, you're supposed to de-risk, enable, incentivize, facilitate the private sector. Now, just imagine if you had a marriage of two people and one was just facilitating the other. Would that be a healthy, functional marriage? Probably not. And even when we're trying to be really kind of like serious, it should be a lender of last resort, right? And I'll get you thinking in different ways later when I say investor of first resort. How different is that? Anyway, so these are problematic because they're very passive. And it's going to be extremely hard to get these, especially the SDGs, but not only, but smart, sustainable, inclusive growth in this kind of facilitating, enabling atmosphere. And so, what should replace it? Well, first of all, this is an incredibly strong paradigm. There's all sorts of even mathematical equations we use to look at this. And it's not that these failures don't exist. I would be kind of crazy to say we shouldn't worry about market failures, given that we just had one of the biggest market failures of all time. The financial crisis itself could be seen as a market failure. But this notion that you're just fixing and putting bandages is what I'm trying to get you to sort of question. And how you would fix a negative externality like pollution is something like a carbon tax. Of course, that's important. How you might fix a public good problem is having public funding of research. Of course, that's important. But the real question is, will bandaging things up actually get you that transformational growth? And Neva said innovation. For me, innovation is about transformational growth. It's about structural change. So will we get structural change just by fixing things? And one of the key problems, this is from a TED Talk I did, and it took a huge amount of time to do this presentation where this slide came from, so I have to always use it to justify the time it took. This idea that all the cool guys are here, right? Basically private entrepreneurs, investors, small, medium, or large, and these bureaucrats, and why do we all think the word bureaucrats is a bad thing? Because we depict them as being kind of black and white, Kafka-esque, even though I must say he is a bit better looking than Zuckerberg. Messing around with a lot of papers, again, at best fixing things and then get the hell out of the way, right? And so value creation is here, at best value redistribution is there. And I would never argue against value redistribution, but I can tell you that if a progressive left, center-left agenda is just about redistribution, you will not get the popular vote. Okay, so lots of what I think we can also get from some of the things I'll be saying is also how to really change the discourse, the narrative, literally the vocabulary. And we shouldn't forget Plato's great insight, he had many, but one of them, which is that storytellers rule the world. And the story this image is telling us, which I can tell you is on the editorial page of the Economist almost every week, is a very specific story about value and wealth and where it comes from. And the big problem is, as an innovation economist, I've studied innovation across many different sectors and time periods, is it would be basically impossible to talk about, to understand the history of big technological changes, what economists call general purpose technologies, those technological changes that have really impacted production, distribution, and also consumption by just getting it through this kind of market fixing policy approach. And it also definitely won't get us the SDGs. They even rhyme, GPTs and SDGs, and neither one of them could come about through a kind of backseat cheerleader role. And I should say, just in case I get misinterpreted, which I often do, is when I say public and when I say state, I'm also going to be talking about a decentralized network of different types of public actors, A. And B, I'll be arguing that it's really about public-private partnerships, as well as partnerships with the third sector, the voluntary sector, that will get us the interesting things of the future and got us some of the most interesting things in the past. But it's the public bit of the public-private that has been so under-theorized and has become incredibly problematic precisely because the words we use are very lame, and you end up getting a self-fulfilling prophecy, where you end up actually getting quite boring policies, and policies that also create institutions that are a bit boring, and the next thing you know, they all get privatized. Anyway, so we need a different view. And personally, I was very influenced by the work of Karl Polanyi, who wrote this great book called The Great Transformation, where he kind of starts way before the issue of innovation. He just says the market. The market itself was actively co-created and co-shaped by policy as well. It was not the private sector. And in fact, we often confuse markets with business. Markets, what they are outcomes. They are outcomes of the interactions between different types of actors. And in his book, which was fascinating, he talks about the national market, which is the capitalist market. International markets and local markets have been around for thousands of years. The capitalist market, which is relatively recent, at best 300 years old, was forced into existence by administrators on the public side. That's not necessarily a good thing, that's just a fact. Now, the kind of markets we want in the future actually really should be questioning what kind of markets do we want, what kind of public and private investments do we need, what kind of value metrics are we using to both justify and evaluate them. But just this point, which is, let's just get rid of the word intervention, whether it's good or bad intervention. The word that you are as a state or as a public entity intervening in the market makes no sense, because the market is an outcome of the interactions between policy, private investment, and again, civil society. We shouldn't forget, by the way, that without trade unions, which are sort of civic organizations, we would not have weekends, we would not have the 8-hour workday, and that, of course, also influenced the kind of markets we have today. So what I tried to do in this book, The Entrepreneurial State, which was translated in many languages, but the best was the German translation, because I don't think I'll ever write another book that's translated as Das Kapital. And I did read Capital here at Tufts, because a great professor I had, who then moved on to Notre Dame, Phil Morawski, got us to read Capital. Actually, here I just read volume 1. It was in PhD, I read volume 1, 2, and 3. But the translation was great. At first, I was like, why didn't they just translate the title, whatever the entrepreneurial state means? And however you translate it in German, and actually the German publisher said we couldn't because the whole left wing would vomit. I was like, okay, that's quite strong. But the word entrepreneurship in Germany actually was, seen as like the commercial, commerce, basically. It didn't have this notion of risk-taking. Anyway, but Das Kapital is fascinating because it actually goes to the heart of the matter. It's the capital of the state. Right? So you are investing in a whole portfolio of different things. If you want the green economy, you're not going to put all your investments in offshore wind. You might have a whole portfolio of different investments along renewable energy. Some may fail, probably quite a bit, because that's the natural part of innovation, but some might succeed. And if you structure that innovation system well, that might have transformative impact, and those successes will be well worth the wait and well worth also some of those failures. So really getting a sense of the long-termism that capital actually requires, capital spending versus just, say, current spending, and the portfolio and the level of risk-taking, and maybe thinking about a revolving fund. That really actually did go to the heart of what I tried to do. But really what I tried to do was start to change the narratives, the discourse, these cartoon images we all kind of have in our heads. Just think, what's the first thing you think of when you hear the word bureaucratic? Is it a good thing or a bad thing? Right? It's probably a bad thing. Why? Why don't we set up really cool, dynamic, and creative bureaucracies to be able to partner with private and other institutions to do cool things? And so what I did was I looked at the whole innovation chain across many different sectors, and even just started to look at the kinds of bold, ambitious risk-taking, right? That's the whole entrepreneurship bit, risk-taking investments, also by organizations that pretty explicitly actually welcomed uncertainty and welcomed that kind of risk-taking process, and also organized themselves in such a way that that was actually part of how they work. So this is not just about public spending per se. This is about particular types of public organizations that played a very important role. I focus mainly on the US, not because the US is more important than other countries, but because the US model, which is often talked about as kind of the Silicon Valley model of innovation, is just so misunderstood. And hence, when it's copied, both here and other parts of the US, but also abroad, you get problems. So Silicon Roundabout is what it's called in the UK, beautiful, was all about, oh, we need more VC. That must be why we're not, innovative, and then kind of nothing happens. Anyway, so what's important here is that the kind of investments went way beyond just fixing the public good problem. This was not just public organizations funding basic research, but also applied research, early stage financing, so patient, high-risk finance downstream to actual companies through programs like SBIR, the Small Business Innovation Research Program, through procurement, giving money to the few SMEs. We often think all the SMEs are innovative. Very few are, about 6%. Few SMEs that were even willing to innovate, wanted to grow, and through procurement policy actually could scale up. But of course, around the world, there's many different ones. YOSMA, which is a public venture capital fund in Israel, has been central to Israel's whole startup nation status. And again, that story also is one that still needs to be told. In-Q-Tel, by the way, the CIA's big public venture capital fund. Few people know about it. It's one of the biggest in the world, and has funded all sorts of things. The NIH, which I'll mention in a minute. But even more downstream, I've already mentioned procurement policy, but also kind of bold, ambitious policies through, we were talking before, things like suburbanization. People did not just wake up and go to the suburbs. There was a whole policy around that, and without suburbanization, mass production, big technological change would not have actually diffused and been fully deployed throughout the economy. Anyway, what do we know about these organizations? Very little, precisely because we've dismissed the public organizations. We just think about public funds. We don't actually go inside. How were they set up? Why have they failed in some countries? Could it be that the career structures were problematic? Could it be that the way they justified their interventions were problematic? But I've already mentioned, again, SBIR, but just to say that this is very interesting because the patient strategic finance that SBIR has provided in the US, if anything, has become even more important in recent years as the financial sector itself has become more short-termist, and private venture capital is very exit-driven. They want their exit to happen in 3 to 5 years through a buyout or an IPO, and the Death Valley phase, kind of this area here, can last even 10 to 15 years. So, it was not VC that got us biotech. It was actually, let me just come back to the other graph in a minute, it was spending like those through the National Institutes of Health, which even after the crisis was spending over $30 billion, but this literally, I like this graph because it looks like a wave. It literally was a wave that was surfed in California and in all over the US through different types of VC financing, where in the case of biotech, which was also in Massachusetts, it was sort of in these years that VC came in. And that is 20 to 30 years after the pathway was sort of led out by this investor first resort kinds of investments, which is just not captured through this market fixing narrative. This is what I did a lot in the book and sort of got a bit too much attention. And people said, oh, she says the state made the iPhone. No, that's not the point. Apple, great company. Steve Jobs, great guy. All sorts of great people working in Apple. Yes, including John Ives, who I've met recently and who's a fascinating character. So, real sense of design, great calligraphy class. Steve Jobs took. He did not take entrepreneurship classes. I always tell people who study entrepreneurship, why, what evidence do you have that this is going to affect your entrepreneurialism? Study philosophy. That might help you more. But what is true is that what they had to put together in this cool way, having taken those design classes, having, this great sense of simplicity and ability to design a gorgeous object, which I'm keeping time on now. Though sometimes when it fails, I think they got pissed off at how much I say the state helped fund it, so it just crashes every now and then, was that, this would be a stupid phone, not a smartphone, had there not been all this technology that they put together in great ways. So what would you do with your smart products without the internet? Government financed. GPS, government financed. Touchscreen display, CIA financed. Be careful when you put your fingers on that phone. And Siri, government financed. So it was absolutely a public-private, if you want, collaboration in terms of the end product. But the Steve Jobs book, right? The book on Steve Jobs, which is over 700 pages, great movie, not one page, not one paragraph, not one sentence, not one word on any of that. That's the problem, right? It's this completely skewed understanding and storytelling that we tell, which of course affects our thinking of how much tax should be paid by these kind of companies. And this is not just about talking about tax evasion and tax avoidance, but what is the right kind of contribution back into the public realm? And we shouldn't forget that Silicon Valley, by the way, the public school system has gone extremely down the drain. And just kind of understanding that whole ecosystem as one which has benefited massively from public investments, and then we failed to think about the public return on those investments is something that I think is very important. In the green economy, which so many people in this room that I've spoken to have been thinking about, we basically see the same pattern that we saw in biotech, nanotech, internet, which is that upper right-hand quadrant of high risk, high capital intensity is filled with different types of public institutions, ones that we also don't understand very much. So in this case, unlike in IT, there is this very strong role of public banks. So the China Development Bank, the German Development Bank called KfW, the European Investment Bank, and up until recently, the Brazilian Development Bank together have been absolutely essential in financing the deployment and diffusion of existing renewable energy, but also financing new types. And in this case, the German one, what's fascinating is that it plays a classic Keynesian role, so counter-cyclical finance. You can see there after the crisis, they increased their disbursements, whereas private sector was decreasing, but also they directed it towards this mission, the Energiewende mission in Germany, which, by the way, has been very interesting because it has lent money not just to German SMEs, but to the small, medium, and large companies willing I always say don't pick the winners, pick the willing, that were willing to engage with this, which also required steel, the steel industry, as inertial as it is in some countries, like the US, where they're about to get massive handouts. In Germany, they would only be able to get government investments if they would transform themselves, modernize themselves, lowering their material content through repurpose, reuse, and recycle strategies in order to, play with the Energiewende emission. This is fascinating. But, what does all this mean? And I think Hirschman, very important development economist who received a Leontief Prize, amazing. I actually just learned that today, had all sorts of great insights, but one that he very much insisted on was that, it's not enough to just talk about great new approaches. Well, what are the different kind of concepts, the lenses that you will provide? And I'm just going to go through this quickly because I only have 5 more minutes, but what I think needs to replace a market-fixing idea is a market co-shaping, market co-creating one. And if I just stop there, that would sound great. You'd be like, okay, sounds good. But what I propose is that there's sort of 4 new types of questions we ask. The first is a kind of psychotherapy one, which is get over the problem of picking winners. Of course we have to pick. Everyone's always told not to do that. You have to pick. You have to make strategic decisions. But how? How can we actually learn from the past? Like what was interesting about going to the moon and back again safely within a generation was how they structured in a really bold way the investments across different types of sectors and the bottom-up solutions that actually were required to get to the moon, of which many failed, and lots of the spillovers in our iPhones came from, indirectly from that kind of bold mission setting. What can we learn from that experience? So instead of saying don't pick, be conscious, have strategic decision-making in government, but how? How to engage civil society in that mission setting. How do you build, then, organizational capacity in the DARPA-type institutions, but also, is that my phone? No. Also in health, also in energy, that can actually welcome that explorative experimentation process, welcome risk-taking, welcome uncertainty. How to create knowledge organizations inside government. How do you assess public sector market-creating investments beyond the market-fixing ones? It's, again, sounds great to say market co-creation, but then if the Treasury comes in and evaluates the public investment as though you were just fixing a market, you get into the usual thing of, stop, you're crowding out. You're crowding out private sector initiative. The BBC has just undergone this for the nth time where it's told it's crowding out private broadcasters. It should just make documentaries about giraffes in Africa and high-quality news, and why are you doing soap operas and talk shows? When actually the great thing about the BBC is it did do across different areas really bold and ambitious programs driven by public value, a concept that philosophers have talked about since Aristotle, economists don't. We talk about the public good, which sounds good. It's called the public good, but it's really restrained to only being able to correct certain public good problems versus really turning this into a strategic, ambitious, active agenda of creating public value across the economy, independent of the format, in this case, the television format. And risks and rewards. How do you actually socialize not just risks, but also rewards? This can be done in all sorts of different ways. I've talked about for example, Bell Labs, which was one of the most ambitious and successful private innovation laboratories co-financed by government inside AT&T. It actually came from a period in which government was much more confident. So AT&T was a monopoly, and government basically said, well, the monopoly is not given to you from God. It's government granted, yes. And the return back to us for having given that to you is that your profits will be reinvested back into the real economy, innovation, big innovation beyond telecoms. And that's where Bell Labs came from. It was a requirement in some ways, not exactly the exact Bell Labs structure. That, of course, then came down to particular decisions that were made. But the need to reinvest those profits today, record level hoarding, $2 trillion being hoarded in the US, so not being reinvested back. We also have record levels of financialization, so $3 trillion worth having been used in things like share buybacks over the last 10 years by the Fortune 500 companies, so not reinvesting back into innovation, big innovation beyond their own little sphere. This is very interesting. Another issue around risks and rewards is patents. Patents as well are monopolies, and we've stopped really thinking about how does the public get back its reward for the 20-year monopoly that a company is given. And that is not about not giving it the patent, but being much more careful about what is being patented. We've increasingly patented upstream, so the tools for research are being patented. We're actually going back, ironically, in a world of big data and open innovation, back to the Middle Ages of secrecy by allowing patents to go so upstream. And they're also extremely wide, right? So strategic patenting. Patents should be, in order for the public to get back the reward, which is diffusion and deployment of that knowledge after the patent is up, because that's a good thing about a patent is you write down things so others can then later learn from it once the monopoly is up. But if in the meantime you've patented everything around it and patented upstream, then you've blocked that capacity also of scientific development in different areas, so you don't get that diffusion later. You could also have agreements on prices. You know, $32 billion a year is what NIH is spending, and then the prices of drugs are set by pharma, and then you need Medicare and Medicaid to come in and bring it back down, or NICE in the UK is the organization that does that. You know, who thought that up? The prices themselves should be reflecting that public contribution. Again, then also conditions around reinvestment. So this is actually just like my 5th slide, and I have another 50, but I think I might just stop here, because what I was going to do for the rest of the presentation was to unpick these. But this is really, I think, what I'd like to consider my contribution, which is that it's not enough just to talk about the entrepreneurial state. I'll just move on quickly to this because it was mentioned. It's about a new lens, but also new practice-based kind of ideas that policymakers can bring to the table. And I'll just end with this, which is a report that I just did for the European Commission, which tried to bring some of these ideas to their policymakers. So the Carlos Moedas, who's the commissioner for the DG of Research, Science, and Innovation, he has 100 billion euros in his budget. And what I said was, well, instead of just funding sort of projects, why don't you think, start with what the challenges are, which they've been talking about for a long time, but kind of just been talking. Think about what a mission might be, get lots of different sectors to be focused on those missions, and then get the instruments in place that really get you that bottom-up project level nurturing of experimentation. And you could do this. I mean, the really important thing to me is this cross sectoral issue, right? So what you don't want to do is have a life sciences strategy where you hand over all this money to one of the most financialized sectors, which is currently the pharmaceutical sector. You ask pharma and other sectors to work together to solve a very concrete problem which has huge public value to it, and again, then get the instruments in place which really foster that bottom-up experimentation and allow that some of these projects might fail. And these are just some examples. This was a plastic-free ocean mission, then 100 carbon-neutral cities by 2031 for a climate change challenge, lots of different sectors and projects, and then one around citizen health and well-being. Those ones on the top are challenges, missions, intersectoral projects. But I'll just go to my last slide here just to tell you what I think is absolutely central, which is think again. Think again. And this is about new ideas, new stories, new narratives, new vocabularies about wealth creation. The institute I've set up just starts with this whole thing of stop saying this, say that, stop saying de-risking, stop saying fixing markets, stop saying leveling the playing field, tilt it in the direction that will actually get you to help solve those societal development goals. If you want long-termism, get a tax policy that actually rewards long-termism over short-termism, over what we have now. Instead of outsourcing, build capacity. Instead of picking winners, pick the willing. Instead of doing net present value calculations to decide whether a public actor should do something, think from the beginning of all the dynamic spillovers that might happen if you are thinking about public value. And stay tuned, because that requires a new theory of wealth and value, which is in the next book. So I'll have to come back.
Okay. Thank you very much. And now we go on to Branko Milanovic, who is currently the visiting presidential professor at the City University of New York and senior scholar at the Luxembourg Income Study. He's widely recognized as the world's leading authority on the measurement of global economic inequality. In 2002, he prepared the first estimates of global income distribution at the household level. Prior to that groundbreaking work, economists only had reliable data on inequality between countries, but not across the world between individuals. Using household surveys, Dr. Milanovic documented the large imbalance in the distribution of global income. For example, his results found that more than half of the world income goes to the top 10%. Among other unique analyses, he's derived widely used estimates of historical income inequality. In a 2007 paper, he estimated income distribution for several pre-industrial societies, including the Roman Empire in 14 AD and Byzantium in the year 1000. His innovative approach considers the extent to which a society's elites are able to extract any surplus produced by the less powerful, thus providing a new way for us to understand and conceptualize inequality. While Dr. Milanovic's early work showed that global inequality was rising, his more recent data show that global inequality is now, in some respects, decreasing due to the huge populations of China and India moving into the middle income area, as well as other effects of globalization. However, his work finds that globalization's benefits have not been equally shared. His famous elephant graph, which I look forward to seeing and which he will discuss today, shows that globalization has mostly benefited two groups: the global middle class, mainly in China and India, and the world's richest. However, two other groups have witnessed stagnating incomes in recent decades: the world's poorest and the middle class in many developed nations, including the United States. Of course, this impact of globalization on American middle-class workers is a driving force behind the current wave of political populism and nationalism. Dr. Milanovic is the author of several renowned books, including Worlds Apart, Measuring International and Global Inequality, The Haves and the Have-Nots, A Brief and Idiosyncratic History of Global Inequality, and Global Inequality, A New Approach for the Age of Globalization in 2016. This last book, which he will discuss today, was recognized by the Financial Times as one of the top economics books of the year and received the Bruno Kreisky Prize for the best political book of 2016. It's nice when a book in economics receives a prize for political work, although maybe it's not always nice. He was also selected by Foreign Policy as one of the world's top 100 people to follow on Twitter, not only for his work on economic inequality, but also as a super fan of soccer. For 2 decades, Dr. Milanovic was the lead economist in the World Bank's research department. He's held positions at Johns Hopkins University and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and currently serves on the advisory board of Academics Stand Against Poverty. We invited Dr. Milanovic to receive the Leontief Prize because he epitomizes how an economist can truly make the world a better place. He relies on the highest quality data to conduct rigorous and transparent analyses. He documents the world as it is, seeking to understand how we got here, but does not shy away from political discussion, advocating for public policies that embody social and economic justice and help us chart a hopeful path forward. Branko, we are delighted and honored to present the Leontief Award for 2018 to you.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much. It's of course a huge honor to receive the Leontief Prize. It's also a pleasure to be here. And also it is, I must say, it's a pleasure also to receive it together with Mariana, whose work I really admired and appreciated for a number of years. So it is on all grounds, I think I'm extremely happy. Now, I would have to set my alarm, because I want to start with two small details which actually are not part of the presentation per se. First of all, when I was in Mexico at a book fair in Guadalajara, which is, I think, one of the largest, if not the largest, Spanish-speaking book fair, and I knew already that I got this year's Leontief Prize. To my surprise and delight, actually I found his PhD dissertation. So this is Leontief's dissertation, which is not translated fully in English. So the only language other than German, because the dissertation was defended in 1929 in Berlin. And the only other language where it was fully translated is Spanish. Now, it's an interesting also detail. Of course, it is about input-output tables, as you would expect, so very sort of rudimentary input-output tables. I mean, not tables, input-output methodologies here. But the interesting part for me was also who were his advisors. One of them was Zombart, who is actually better known, I think, as a sociologist. And the second one, for those who are interested in Marxian or Marxist economics, is Bortkiewicz, who was actually the person who wrote the review of the work, because the work is technical, mathematical, and I don't think that Zombart really knew what the heck was going on in the dissertation. So I just wanted to bring this up because I think it's a pleasure, of course, that Leontief, whose work I've actually, obviously, as we all have admired, and he combines this ability to do theoretical, highest level of theoretical work with lots of applied work. I think it was, of course, a pleasure to see his young, when he was 23, so that was a very early work of his. Now, the second part is already part of my talk, but I have, let me just see if I can, this is not, let's see. Is this, wait, I think I turned it backwards. But before I start with that, I have to say that actually it is on a more somber or maybe a pessimistic note. I would, of course, talk about what were the changes in global inequality, and it's based on my book on global inequality that you can see there. But I have to say that economics, as Alfred Marshall said, is really about the ordinary business of life. So we can actually do projections, and I will do them, and I will talk about China, about India, about the United States, and so on. But nowadays, unfortunately, because we live in a situation where possibility of a war is quite likely, not likely, but there is a greater than zero possibility, all these numbers would be totally changed. And for people who work on income inequality, work has acquired recently, rightly so, a greater importance than in the past. The World War I, for example, totally changed inequality between nations, totally changed economic policies, social policies within nations. A war that we might experience now would absolutely make nonsense of all of these calculations. So I think it is important to keep in mind that. And that's something that actually, to use Taleb's terminology, it is really a rare event. It's an event which is utterly unpredictable, and it's an event that can totally change everything. So I've become recently less, maybe because I've become less optimistic, I don't introduce my projections with the same degree of enthusiasm as I did in the past, because I have this sort of a dark cloud which says to me, well, maybe all of that will make no sense in 10 years. So after that, of course, sort of somber introduction, I have to forget about this and then assume that we live in a world as business as usual. And I think that two things which actually are very specific to our world are, first, the complete dominance of capitalism mode of production, which I defined, and actually that's my next book, which is called Capitalism, Alone, as in a very simple, in a sort of Max Weber, Karl Marx Weber definition of capitalism. It's actually economic activity conducted with privately owned capital, using wage labor and decentralized coordination. And that's basically what you have all around the world. You have it in Nigeria, as you have it in Russia, as you have it in China, as you have it in the United States and elsewhere. Now, there are, of course, different variants of capitalism. I will not talk about that today. And actually, that's a big topic of my next book. I sort of contrast what they call liberal or / meritocratic capitalism, where the United States is the best example, to what taking Max Weber's terminology, call political capitalism of China. But I will not talk about this today, but I think it's really a defining feature of our time. The second defining feature of our time, which will figure quite prominently in my talk today, is the resurgence of Asia. Now, what is actually interesting there is something that we, of course, all know, is that China and India and Indonesia and Vietnam and Burma and so on are becoming much richer than they used to be. But what is interesting in a world historical sense is that Asia, relative to Europe, and when I say Europe, I mean Europe, and as Angus Madison called it, Europe and its offshoots, which means really the United States, Canada, and even Australia and New Zealand, the relative incomes are now going back between Asia and Europe, or will go back to the position of where they were before the Industrial Revolution. So to a position of like 1500 or 1600. So that's actually interesting. This is a total change in economic geography. You're basically going to the situation that we know in the past where Europe and Asia, like if you look at, for example, in 1200, 1300, and you compare city-states in Italy with similar cities in China, the differences were very small. It's very unclear which was a little bit richer than the other. Maybe actually it's impossible even, I think it's probably impossible to determine. And then there was, we will see that in my numbers, there was of course the Industrial Revolution. Now what the Industrial Revolution did, it set one part of the world on a trajectory to high growth and high incomes, and that, as you will see in a moment, increased income inequality and created a distribution of economic activity that for some of us who are older, when we were born, we took it as a normal state of affairs. But it was not a normal state of affairs. It was actually an anomaly to some extent that over 2 centuries, one part of the world was enormously richer than the rest of the world. And in that sense, that anomaly, under quotes, is now coming to an end with the rise of Asia. But the rise of Asia also means the emergence of the global or middle, or what I call more, I think more precisely, maybe median class, because the use of word middle class, particularly in the context of rich countries, overestimates in people's minds incomes of people in Asia, because they're not, by American standards, middle class. They actually would be much poorer than the American middle class. So I will talk about that, and then I will end with some political or philosophical issues that are brought up by looking at the global income distributions and that we don't see at the level of individual countries. And I often liken the work on global income inequality. Of course, it's important to know the numbers and to document that, but it actually changes your perception or your ideas or your knowledge. In other words, it is like moving from a 2-dimensional world to a 3-dimensional world. So let me, for example, give you this, one of the political issues, global inequality of opportunity. When we speak about inequality of opportunity, there is almost nobody, not even on the right wing, extreme right wing, nobody would deny that. They would say, of course, there are other issues, transmission of wealth, you don't want to tax people with high wealth because they will not work, and so on. But nobody says it's a bad thing to have equality of opportunity. And we take it also that there should be obviously equality of opportunity would be between individuals, between races, between genders, and all that. But we never talk about global inequality of opportunity. Now, there may be reasons, and actually to some extent Rawls came fairly close to that, to rejecting our concern with global inequality of opportunity. But whether you accept that you should deal with that or not, I think it's an issue that has to be put on the table. And the only way that you can put it on the table is when you say, well, there are people in country X, which is very poor, whose lifetime incomes are 1/10 or 1/20 of lifetime income of equivalent person in a rich country. And then you ask the question, does inequality of opportunity, or actually the desire for equality of opportunity, does it end at the national border? And I'm leaving that, because I'm not a political philosopher, I'm not giving an answer whether it should be cosmopolitan position or a statist position. But I think we have to face that and put it on the table. Actually, political philosophers were the ones who did that much before the economists, and why they found my company interesting and why I found their company interesting when I learned so much about political philosophy was because I was kind of probably among the first to put numbers on that. So they knew something was wrong, but they had no numbers. Economists had no idea that anything was wrong, and they didn't have numbers. So that's where the issue was. Then I would say something about what you might call, from the Rawlsian perspective, global income distribution. And then I would actually, and maybe I should just give you now the bottom line. God knows whether I would actually end this talk ever. But I would give you the bottom line is what I call, can national vices produce global virtue? Obviously, it reminds you of Mandeville. And what is behind that? It's actually we have two developments which seem contradictory, and very often people have trouble absorbing them. Is that we have on one hand increases of inequality in practically all individual countries in the world, more or less, give or take Brazil or Mexico, which are also very highly unequal but have become less unequal. But anybody else, like you take China, you take India, you take the United States, you take UK, you take Russia, you take Sweden, for example, that people don't know. Sweden had a dramatic increase in inequality over the last 30 years. You have increased inequality. So this is what I call national vice. But we have a global decline of inequality driven, as Niva said before, by essentially the rise of China and India. And that's the global virtue. So then the question becomes, and it's a political question, and it's obviously reflected in the political arena in the United States, and also with Brexit, and also with Alternative für Deutschland, is the question, how do we reconcile the two? Is the cost of public virtue private, or I'd rather national vice? So are the two related? Is the rise of China being paid by the middle class of the United States? And again, I will not have answers to that, but I think we have to put them in the context, as you will see actually, of global inequality. And of course, that's where the elephant graph would come will be quite useful. Now, let me then go into slides proper. This is an estimate, just to give you an idea, an estimate of global inequality, which is Gini index on the vertical axis, and time. So it starts with 1820. It's based on new Madison numbers, because the Madison Committee is updating the numbers. So actually I'm using the new Madison numbers because, you know, the GDPs of the countries change, because obviously we know more now about either Dutch GDP per capita in 1850 or French or South African or so forth. And then we also use 2011 PPP numbers. And without going into all details, which I already mentioned, you can see actually the increase in the 19th century, throughout 19th century, because it was the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the West. Then you have a plateauing. You have, of course, a sort of a slight decline even during World War I and the Great Depression. Then again an increase, and then a plateauing. Now, I would like you to also know, of course, you see now the decline was basically the rise of Asia. So I would like also you to think of this in a very sort of mirror-like terms. What happened with the first Industrial Revolution was one part of the world became rich. That created sort of, it's like a little bit like a Big Bang. It created gaps between the nations, which actually translated into gaps between individuals. Countries themselves became more unequal. So there are two forces pushing global inequality up, differences between the countries, and within each country, greater inequality. And the current time, which is in some sense the undoing of the Industrial Revolution. It's undoing in the sense that the countries which were left out and that remained poor, and actually in the case of China even went down in absolute terms, in real income, are now coming back. So as they come back, of course, they're driving global inequality down. And you know, when you think of this, you have really a remarkable similarities, again, in a mirror. What happened with Indian manufacturing, with cotton manufacturing, when Manchester overruled them? It was deindustrialization of India. What is happening now when China manufacturers overrule Europe and the United States, the industrialization of the West. So they are remarkable mirror images, which then you see in a picture of global inequality like here. And then another thing which is very important when we study global inequality is to divide global inequality into inequality, which is the red portion, which is due to location, which is basically inequality between the countries. So you have there, the assumption is, like, suppose what would be inequality if every American had the average income of the United States, and every Chinese average income of China, and every Spaniard average income of Spain, and how much is due to inequality within nation states, which would be the class element which I have here. And what actually is striking there, because it has political implication, is that if you are Marx writing in 1867 Das Kapital, you basically have a situation where these two elements are of equal importance, relatively speaking. They're very close. You know, gray area is almost, it's not exactly the same like location, but it's close to it. So in that context, you can speak of, you know, international solidarity of labor force. Why? Because laborers, workers, would have relatively similar incomes to each other, and their, you know, opponent would be domestic bourgeoisie. But what happens, and of course it's interesting, we have of course letters from Engels and others, actually what happens then when rich countries spread that wealth to their population? What happens in the extreme case when you actually have location being the dominant factor of global inequality. So then obviously all that story about the identity of interest between workers of country X and Y really falls, you know, apart. And that's why I had Frantz Fanon, because Fanon was really sort of an exemplar of the 1960s, early, when the world was divided. The third world, as he called it, was the proletariat of the world. And the West was the bourgeoisie of the world. And as you know, for example, for those who are older, remember Mao Zedong. That was exactly the same. Actually, even the phrase is the same. It was the third world was the peasantry of the world. And that was, of course, he's translating his Chinese experience. And the West were the citizens, the burghers, the bourgeoisie, that would be essentially they're put in an inimical position. So there was really a huge change from a situation where you had poor people were like all like together against some local bourgeoisie to a situation where the world is segmented in two groups of countries. But with the rise of Asia and with the projection in the future where actually that location component shrinks, we might end in 2050 or 2070 or whatever in a situation which is not dissimilar from what we have seen in the 19th century, where the class element within nations would become relatively important, or maybe of equal importance as the element of location. And I think that you already see that. Now, you see it not only in the rise of Asia, but you see it in the rise of the within national inequalities, in polarization within countries. So the countries of the rich West, I think, might look very similar to the way that Latin America looks today, is that you would have a polarized society where actually the bottom part would be in the global ranking around the median, which has never happened in the last 200 years. When we talk about the West, we talk about people who are in the top 25% of the global income distribution, even the poorer ones. How would West and how would democracy in the West function when the poorer people are the global median? And they get replaced by Indonesians, Chinese, and others. So this is, I think, a big question. So it is not longer, we are not dealing only with numbers. We are dealing with actually a political reality, which I believe is behind these numbers. And simply another illustration of that, this is the relative incomes that was based on Madison's data, new data, of China, Indonesia, and India. China and India are contrasted with the UK. Indonesia is contrasted with the Netherlands. And then you see actually that overturning of what happened in the 19th century. Essentially, what it shows you is that the Asian countries became quite poorer compared to the European countries, and then since 1980 approximately, you have this major sort of change in directions, and China now, going in probably a dozen years, will be back to its relative position, which is 1/3. It is not still the same, but it's a relative position that it was in 1820. And again, when you make other extrapolations, which are not crazy, like China growing at 6% and the European Union growing at 2%, you actually end up with China being at the mean income of the European Union by 2040, I think 2045 or so on. So this is this major change in economic geography and inequality. Another way to look at it is actually you take in 2002 and 2011 incomes of the population of China and the US, and I will not now go into difficulties that we have getting microdata from China. That's yet another problem. This is based on microdata. Chinese microdata have become more and more difficult to get, and I say the number of Chinese surveys is only matched by their unreliability, because depending on which survey you use, you get very different results. But basically what you have there is that you have moved from a situation where only about a quarter of the Chinese population overlapped at all with the US population to a situation where 70% of the Chinese now overlap. So this is, of course, a huge change in a decade. So let me just summarize this. So when we talk about global inequality, we should keep in mind the long run and the medium term. Over the long run, as I've explained, I think actually it is really the technological revolution that determines the distribution of economic activity and also influences quite a lot what happens to inequality within countries. Obviously, policies matter there as well. In the medium term, the situation is a little bit more complex because we really, the changes are of course, more frequent. Is really what you look at. What happens to within national income distributions? Obviously, if more countries become more unequal, then it would push global inequality up. Is there a catching up of poor countries? That's where Africa plays a huge role. Whether there will be convergence of Africa in the future or not will determine largely what happens to global inequality in the future, because Africa is the only continent with sizable increase in population. And then finally, what happens to the large populous countries, that was China and India, but it will more and more become, Zaire, Congo, and Nigeria, and Sudan, and Egypt, that would actually influence what will happen in global income inequality. Now, let's look at the sort of this medium term. First of all, this is a very simple graph to sort of interpret and to show. It shows you on the horizontal axis income in PPP terms, and it shows you on the vertical axis it's the density function. So what you notice there is that actually between 1988 and 2011, you have had this much thicker middle. So that's where basically Asian middle class is. And what is interesting also that you have moved from a situation that Danny Kwa called twin peaks. You had a big peak of people who are very poor, and then you had another peak of people in the West who are rich, but these two twin peaks kind of existed. Nowadays, of course, you have much more in the middle. That's where, as I said, lots of Asian population, the middle class is. Now, the elephant graph is here. I will go quickly because many people have seen it, but it essentially what it does, it shows you on the horizontal axis, it gives you your percentile in the global income distribution, not your, but all 100 percentiles. And on the vertical axis, it shows you real income gain between 1988 and 2008. And I'll show you 2011, which is the update. And the basic story is relatively simple. There is this point here with large increases in income, with the population being around the global median. And in this case, actually, the average increase is 80%. But if you take China, there are increases of the third urban decile, fourth urban decile, which are like 300%. So that's where really the big winners of globalization are. The next group of big winners is the people who are at the very top there. You see at the right corner, right upper corner, this is the top 1%. So essentially, you have two groups that have really done extremely well during this period of globalization. This is Asia and the global top 1%. Now, that graph attracted so much attention, not only because of that, which of course to some extent was known, and because we were able to locate the Western lower or middle classes in that same graph. And not surprisingly, first we knew that they actually have not grown as much as the top because inequalities in the rich countries went up. So it's a no-brainer that actually these people at the 80th percentile had to grow much, that they grew, their incomes grew much more slower than the people at the top. Similarly, they didn't grow up as much as the Asian middle classes did. So they're actually there in a position where their growth was very small, very modest, not only in the US, but also among large Western countries, Germany and Japan. These two countries get overlooked. Japan not so much because their performance has been very, very sluggish. But Germany has this kind of mystique of success. But if you look at the German real wage, if you look at the median income of the German family, it has been stagnant for 20 years. So Germany is there as well. And that's actually what, of course, was obvious there, is that leads to a political issue, that you have the middle class, which is being squeezed from one side, from the upcoming and growing Asia, and on the other hand, by indifference, if you will, if you want to call it, of their own national global top 1%. So that's where the big squeeze of the middle in the rich world was, and that's how it gets translated when you look at within the global income distribution. This is the same graph for 2011, extending the period where now the global top 1%, which is overwhelmingly composed still of the people from the rich countries, is not as significant in terms of increase because they have suffered from the global financial crisis. But the middle has become even more important because China has continued growing at 6 or 7 or 8%. India is now the highest growing economy in the world. So you see that the middle has actually become even more important. I will skip this slide because I think it's sort of too detailed and I don't have time. But I want to basically illustrate the same slide, the elephant graph, with two countries. This is Thailand and the US. Now, the blue dots are the US, the second, third, fifth, and the 10th decile. Now, look, they really follow the global because they actually determine what is happening largely because of the size of the population, the global. But then compare them with their the original positions where Thailand was also the second, third, fifth, 10th decile. Now, the 10th decile of Thailand was approximately where the American second decile was. But you see, Thailand grew almost doubling its real income. The American second or third decile increased their real income by 20%, which is shown on the vertical axis. So what is actually nice here in this graph, which I didn't use in my book, is that actually you can take different pairs of countries, put their deciles, and put them in the position where they were in 1988, and then see, Greek third decile did very, very poorly, but it was in a better position because it was richer than the Thailand's, for example, eighth decile. And then you basically, what you see is that at a given level of income, Asian deciles outperformed, like all of them practically, outperformed the Western deciles. I have how many minutes? 2? Okay, maybe 0, but I'll call it 2. But did it exist before? Actually, did this elephant exist before? Obviously, the data there are not as good, nearly as good, but I actually tried to look at that. Basically, no. If you go from 1970 to 1992, you have the graph that you can see here on your left. If you go in the current period, you see the graph that I've already shown you, and this is the key part. That's the key part, is that actual huge difference in the record of growth in the last quarter century between the poorer people in the West and the middle classes of Asia. And that was not apparent then. So I will actually stop here because the political issues, there are 3 of them. I think I already mentioned many of them. I explained there is a concept which I introduced in one of my papers, and then it's in the book, and it's the concept of citizenship premium or citizenship rent, which is the sort of the background to that problem that I mentioned of the global inequality of opportunity. When it comes to optimal quote unquote global income distribution, I play with two possibilities. Should we direct our attention to within national redistributions, or should we rather direct our attention to equalizing mean incomes of the countries? And because the location is still the overwhelming part of the global inequality, you get more bang for a buck, if you will, from equalization of incomes than from equalization or incomes between countries than from equalization of incomes within countries. But as I said before, that would change. As that gray portion called class becomes larger and larger, the importance of the class or within national inequality would increase. And the final thing is this, sort of trade-off or this return to Mandeville, where we now look at what may be considered to be national vices, but which may be indispensable or may not have been indispensable for the global virtue. So thank you very much again.
Well, that was terrific, and we do have some time for questions, and Brian Roach is going to come up here and handle them. Thank you, Brian.
Right, thank you, Mariana and Branko, for those wonderful talks, and for staying pretty much on schedule. We have maybe about 10 minutes or so for questions and answers before you can enjoy the reception afterward. I also wanted to mention that we do have GDAE materials over there you can review, and also books for sale, right? Both Mariano and Branko have books for sale there, and maybe if you ask nice, they will sign them for you, perhaps. So why don't we maybe alternate questions? Let me ask Branko and Mariana to come up here, please, right? Yeah. And yeah, maybe we can alternate talks between the two of them, and I'll bring, oh, we have another one. Ern?
Hello, hi. I have a question for Professor Mazzucato. I'm from the Fletcher School. Using the venture capital model in public sphere, I got the question of discipline, at least in the private space. If you don't perform well, you're not going to raise more money. And maybe you could speak a little bit about that, how to get that aspect of discipline into public sphere.
So are you saying there is discipline in the private sphere? That's interesting. There is? The financial crisis.
Performing well, then.
Anyway, right. So I'll just give you an example of a real weird way that we currently think about it. So everyone knows about Solyndra, right? Raise your hand if you know about what happened to Solyndra. It went bust, right? And people got pissed off. Why'd they get pissed off? Because the taxpayer had to pick up this bill of a $500 million guaranteed loan to that company, and they were like, government, you're so stupid. Go back to enabling, leveling the playing field. Don't make bets. Don't be like a venture capitalist that actually makes a bet on companies. How many people know about Tesla? You probably know about Tesla, but you don't think of it like you do with Solyndra. You don't think of it as a government bet. The same, more or less the same amount of money went to the Tesla-esque car, right? It was a huge success. Now, the problem there is not that government failed, because every VC that I've ever met brags about how much they failed, and they got up again and succeeded, right? Kleiner Perkins, big VC company, makes a huge amount of money with Genentech. You can bet they had at least 7 or 8 failures in that biotech portfolio. Then they got the Genentech investment successful, fantastic, it more than paid back the Solyndra loss. So what did Obama do with Tesla? He had all these Goldman Sachs guys in the government, and the one time the guys could have been useful, they weren't. At least, what they actually knew about, which is investing. What he said was, if you don't pay back the loan, right? A lot of money, we get 3 million shares in your company. It's like, really? You want 3 million shares in a crappy company that doesn't pay back its loan? Hattie said, if you pay back the loan and you're successful, as Tesla today is, everyone talks about Elon Musk as the new Steve Jobs in terms of those narrative and discourses, the price per share went from $9 a share in 2009 when the loan was taken out to $90 a share in 2013. So actually, it wasn't a lack of discipline. It was just a lack of saying, we are an investor first resort. Guess what? We're not just going to hand out money, socialize risk, and privatize rewards. We're going to set it up like a portfolio. And the question, and I don't think it should happen just through equity. I gave examples of it happening through prices, conditions and reinvestment, patenting, relationships, et cetera. But in this case, why not take out some equity, in Tesla to structure that portfolio literally as a portfolio. So rather than seeing it from the lens that you're saying, which is a really important one, of, kind of efficiency and discipline, why don't we actually look at the actual investments government has made, and this is actually international. China, by the way, is one of the most active investors today in renewable energy, wide portfolio. Why don't we say, hey guys, structure it as a portfolio, structure it in such a way that you actually do get also a social reward and not just socializing the risks. And I can tell you there is extremely little appetite for that. And funny enough, the biggest appetite I hear is actually from the business community because they kind of get it, right? But the political backlash is, no, what are you talking about? Government really just should be there enabling. And if you want government as just as enabler, you would not have, again, gotten all these successes that I talked about. But it's not enough to talk about the successes. You need to go to the next step and think about the inequality issues. And personally, I think that lots of the modern day inequality has come from, the kind of stuff I've been talking about. So capital gains tax, which fell by 40% in 5 years, happened through a particular story that was being told at the time through the National Venture Capital Association about where wealth came from. And Warren Buffett, he's not a communist, I can tell you, but he said, stop doing that. I don't even look at capital gains, I look at opportunities. And lots of what I'm talking about is if you structure these portfolios in ambitious, mission-oriented ways, A, but also in strategic ways, so you, again, are also socializing some of the rewards, that is, over time, also one that creates more sentiment about where the future opportunities are by business, which historically has been crowded in by those ambitious investments, but by not thinking about the public purse, then we also have a problem about, where the money actually will come from. And either we go back to the time of Eisenhower, which, by the way, was a president at the time that NASA and DARPA were founded, and the top marginal taxation rate was 91%. Either we go back to that time, or we also just admit we can create the money, as we do in wartime, or we also decide about these more sort of concrete ways to structure these portfolios so some of the reward comes back. And I think that's the question. It's not about, is government as efficient as a private venture capitalist? Sorry, that was an extremely long answer.
Hi, question to you both. I'm Hassan Massoud. I'm a science journalist from England and presently at MIT. Professor Milanovic, just the last slide that you put up there about, in a sense, the sort of shrinking or stagnant wage growth in North America and in Europe. What policy levers do both of you think exist to be able to change that? If you assume that that's something to worry about, and is, for example, and Mariana, maybe a question for you is, the British Labour Party is thinking of nationalising, key industries. Is that part of the answer?
Okay, let me see if I can manage this. First manage the mic and then manage the question.
Use mine. Yeah, I think it's fine.
Well, maybe I'll use yours. Thank you. I'll give it back to you. I will be brief on that. I think actually the first issue to realize is that there is, of course, there a contradiction, and that's actually the essential issue, is that lots of our income and employment and everything else is globally determined. So essentially, you have an economy which operates according to global principles, but it does not have global governments or global government. And whoever is affected by that really does not have an addressee which he or she would normally have with the nation state. So then you go to the nation state. So the entire, obviously, all the policies are still, which could help the middle class, are entirely determined at the level of the nation state still. And what can they do? There are many things that they can do. I'm not going to tell you anything original there, but there is issue of taxation. Actually, Mariana mentioned that, taxation of very high incomes. I think that actually inheritance tax would be very good thing to bring back, because in most countries it has either been abolished or, as in the US, actually the threshold and the exemption starts very high. Then the education. Then what I actually, and I don't want to expand on that because again it's in my new book, is what I called deconcentration of capital incomes. That's something which has really not been noticed very much is that capital incomes and ownership from capital have remained extremely concentrated. Actually, if you take the United States, 10% of the highest capital owners, so wealth owners, own 92% of all assets. So practically the US is owned by 10% of people. Because when you look at the distribution, you have 30% of people who have negative or zero net assets. Then you have everybody else who has housing, practically only housing. And then you have it only in the top 5%, 7% who have financial assets. So there are, I think, many issues of redistribution that can actually affect some of the, help alleviate the problems that we have talked about. But then there are also, and that's, I think, Mariana's part of the answer, there must be other policies which would affect that, that would help the losers of globalization through direct, not through distribution, but directly through the actually economic system per se.
I think this works.
Oh, your works? Okay, good.
You're right, it doesn't work. Hello? Okay. So, I think I've already answered that, so I'll just quickly snippet it, which is, Piketty's book, as important as it was, I thought the end was actually a bit of a slower start and than the beginning, which is you can't just tax the wealth. You actually need a different perspective of where wealth comes from. And unless we tackle that, any sort of taxation of wealth will be short-lived. You then get another politician who comes in and changes that taxation structure. If instead we actually have an idea of wealth as having been collectively generated through different types of stakeholders, as well as having a different notion of the governance of companies, stakeholder governance, not shareholder governance, precisely because the wealth of these that these companies themselves generate is, again, collectively produced. That's the first step. And I think if you don't take that first step, any measure will just be, have very little resilience because it'll just be politically volatile. We need a different understanding. Nationalization or not. Some industries perhaps should be nationalized, but I think that's an older question. The really a key question is that when, in an era where everyone's talking about partnerships between public, private, I mentioned the voluntary sector, civil society is key, for example, to setting some of these missions. The Energiewende mission in Germany actually came from a huge amount of civic engagement. The real question is, how do you set up these partnerships in such a way that it produces an ecosystem, again, another trendy word, that is symbiotic and mutualistic and not parasitic. It's incredible how we are repeating in space, literally outer space, the same problematic parasitic ecosystems we have on Earth. And so Novartis, very rich company in the pharmaceutical sector, is working for free on the International Space Station and patenting. Who thought that up? We literally have to rethink the contracts through mechanism design, through all sorts of different ways. The contracts which, in fact, match the ambitions that we're having. We have very old and problematic contracts which generate problematic partnerships. And if we get that right, you can actually, address lots of societal challenges as well as some of these issues around the budget. But one of the big problems in the UK is we had these public-private partnerships in health, PFI schemes, where the public bit was literally just, undertaking some of the costs that the private sector before was taking, so de-risking it, if you want. It completely let go of any sort of directionality. And the most successful, I think, and this is why I look at the mission-oriented approach, kinds of partnerships have been when the public was able to actually set a direction, crowd in business investment, which was like, oh, wow, that's going to be a cool new area. I'm going to get in there too, but also really facilitate that bottom up, but also set some conditions attached. You don't just privatize space. And I think the kind of details around that, which I don't have time to talk about, but I've been looking at that in many different sectors, how you set up symbiotic, mutualistic partnerships is the way to also not only tackle some of these inequality issues, because they have been one of the key sources of problematic ways to share the rewards of wealth that's created.
I think we should probably end there.
Oh, sorry.
I know, Nick. One more. Okay. One more really quick question, really quick answer.
A question for both of you, and I don't know if it's a softball or a hardball. Carlotta Perez has talked about number of industrial revolutions. And the next one, like the past ones, is going to be boom and bust. Bust. We're in a bust now. We're going to have a tremendous increase, providing we go green. Now, are we likely to go green? Are we reaching plateaus in technology where you can't expect the kind of growth that we've had? Is Carlotta right or is she wrong?
So Carlotta's key point is that green should become a direction, right? So instead of having the Robert Gordon, or is it Solo, I can't remember, one of them put up a toilet, indoor toilet here, and internet here, and said, why has this thing, the internet, not had the effect that the indoor toilet and electricity has had? She says, actually what this mass production system had was that suburbanization direction, which actually allowed its power to get diffused throughout the economy. She says green should be that today. We should have a green direction, not just in terms of renewable energy investments, which again, many of people in this room talk about, but to become a direction for even the ICT revolution to get fully diffused. And that's what she says we no longer have today, kind of bold and ambitious governments that are willing to even talk about the demand side as much as the supply side. And the problem is that as long as green is seen as just a patchy thing, so a bit of green science here, a bit of feed-in tariffs there, a bit of solar there, you absolutely don't get that green transformational growth, which is in the end what we need in order to just have another, say, clean tech bubble, which, by the way, we're about to have. And what's interesting, I think, is Fang here? Yeah, she's a doctoral student, which I'm very happy to be one of the co-supervisors of in GDAE. Well, it's combined with GDAE. It's in the Fletcher School, but I can't remember what the relationship is with GDAE, but you're somehow related to that too. She's in fact looking precisely at the way that different types of investments around the world are structuring their portfolios. She's comparing China, Germany, and some other countries. And I think this is an issue because some of our work has looked at the way that, for example, that global public utilities might be financing renewables, but just one bit of renewables. And it becomes very hard for the system to be resilient if you're putting all your eggs in one sort of part of that basket. So retaining a diverse portfolio within green, but seeing it not just as a technological portfolio, but also one that requires bold, ambitious demand-side policies is what's difficult about this. And I think it's very hard to do. I mean, it's not hard to do, but we're not seeing that kind of ambition today.
Well, this works now. I would be very brief, actually. I don't have really a very strong opinion. This is not something that I actually work very much on, but I'm very old-fashioned in the sense that I'm pro-growth. And I think when you work with global inequality, you cannot not be pro-growth. First, because of the effects of global growth in the South, Third World, whatever you want to call it, on reduction of global inequality that I talked about and global poverty, but also because we don't realize actually that the world is still in an extremely poor place. So in that graph where you see the middle, of course, growing, it's because we put a log axis on the logs on the x-axis, but incomes there around the median are actually lower and significantly lower than the poverty threshold in Western Europe or the United States. So it simply is the case that if you want people to have some reasonable income to live on, you just cannot do it with the current envelope of global GDP. There are two possibilities. I was saying that before. One possibility, you take the rich people and take 80% of their income. And I'm actually inviting anybody to put that on as a political proposition and to run on that. And the other possibility, you have to increase the global envelope by about 3.2 times. So these are the real world issues. Now, of course, there may be that your green growth, intensity of carbon emissions per unit of GDP and so on can be reduced. But I think it's important to keep in mind the ratios, is that actually if you want everybody to live at the median income of the richer countries, then you need a GDP of the world which is 3.2 times greater.
Thank you both very much, and I hope that there'll be some continuation of this conversation during another hour, and we're really grateful to you both for giving us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.